Good morning from the Netherlands. Welcome to all of you who are attending this webinar organized by the Netherlands Commission for Environmental Assessment. The topic of today is a sustainable hydropower sector, the added value of strategic environmental assessment. Before we start, I would like to emphasize the rules of today's webinar. For questions, please make use of the Q&A icon on your screen, and please do not use the chat function because that is disabled for today's webinar. During the entire webinar, all participants will be muted. And for your information, the webinar will be recorded and will afterwards become available on the website of our commission. So the program for today, after the introduction, I will give a brief presentation on sustainable hydropower sector and the role of strategic environmental assessment. Secondly, a presentation will be presented by Lothar Lunde, a case study on SEA for energy planning in Vietnam. Thirdly, François Tetreault will present an SEA case study from Rwanda. And finally, I will summarize the lessons we have learned in the field of SEA and the hydropower sector. And then, of course, we still have some time in the program for questions and answers by you. So the presenters, as well as myself, will be member of the panel. So please make use of the Q&A function to ask your questions during the different presentations, and we will gather and select a number of those questions for the last 10 to 15 minutes to be answered. So the question, of course, is why this webinar and why now? Well, the direct reason is that in June this year, we finished a study focusing on the influence of those SEAs that supported the hydropower sector. It has been a worldwide study covering a period of about 25 years. And well, I will definitely come back to the results of this study in today's webinar. But probably more interesting is why did we start this study a few years ago? Well, the main reason was that in my work as a technical secretary for the Netherlands Commission of Environmental Assessment, I'm traveling together with my colleagues around the world, supporting the use and adaptation of strategic environmental assessment in strategic planning. And frequently I was confronted with a question from a high-level staff member from the Ministry of Energy. Arend, very interesting SEA, but please show me 3 or 4 good practice SEA case studies and show me the added value. And then unfortunately, I had to answer that I could not share that type of good practice case studies yet, although I was aware that there are that type of studies available. So that was probably the most important reason to start this study about 2.5 years ago. And well, we released this study in June this year. So definitely we will dive into this study and hope to share some of our lessons learned with all of you. So let me introduce the panelists of today. Lothar Lunde, he is going to present the case study on SEA. Lothar is an environmental and spatial planning expert with over 20 years of research and working experience. He has a master's degree from the University of Leipzig in Germany. And the last 10 years, he worked in Southeast Asia, supporting about 10 ESIAs for the Asian Development Bank and World Bank. And he is presently in the process of finalizing his PhD research. So, Lothar, before we start, what is your main reason to attend and contribute to this study?
Thanks, Aaron, for an introduction. One reason is, of course, because we have worked with the Mayor Commission for quite a while in Southeast Asia. So since I started with the ESIA, the Mayor Commission was also involved in contributing. And the case that I will present is actually a good case where we can show not only how SEA capacity building has improved SEA in Vietnam, but also how it actually contributed to make target plans more sustainable. And I think that's a real impact that we wanted to demonstrate.
Thank you, Lothar. I'm looking forward to your presentation. Then the second presenter of today is François-Xavier Tetereau. He is a water resources expert living and working in Rwanda. He worked for the government of Rwanda in different positions in the last couple of years. And his latest position, he was the head of the Water Resources Department. In that position, he was leading the first National Water Resources Master Plan for Rwanda, including the application of SEAs for all river basins. So, François, same question to you. So what has been the motivation for you to contribute to this study and today attend and present at this webinar?
Thank you, Alan. I think similar to my colleague, as you well mentioned, some time back, I did contribute in terms of implementing an integrated water resource management plan process, during which, with the support of NCEA, we applied a strategic environmental assessment. So for me, it was a new experience because the two processes happened to be quite similar. But I thought I could share my reflections on the benefit of combining the two processes because I ended up realizing that the result becomes much better when one's combining the two processes rather than just on the assumption that they are similar. In some cases, people would feel that it doesn't make sense to have the two processes in parallel. So that's what my main motive to share my personal reflections based on my experience. Thank you.
Thank you, François. And also we're looking forward towards your presentation. So before I will give a brief introduction on the topic, I would like my assistant, Anne Hardon, also colleague and manager within the commission, to set the poll, because we would like to know from all of you what is your experience in the field of SEA, so we have a better idea of the knowledge base of all our participants. So please answer the question, how much SEA experience do you have? Is it none or little? Is it some SEA experience, or do you consider yourself as being an experienced SEA practitioner? So please fill in the question. And Anna informs me that almost everybody has now filled in the poll. Well, whilst we are waiting, I can already inform you that the large number of people registered are really from all over the world. So that is really exciting to know. Here we see the results of the poll. About 30% has none or little experience with SEA. About 60% has some experience with SEA. And there are also some more experienced SEA practitioners in the audience. So thank you very much. Then I will continue with the first presentation. And that will start now. Strategic environmental assessment supporting a more renewable hydropower sector. That is the topic of this presentation. I will address the following three topics: some characteristics of the hydropower sector, the basics of SEA, assuming that not all of you are familiar with the concept of SEA, and thirdly, I will focus on the study we have executed on SEA supporting hydropower development. So some characteristics of the hydropower sector. Presently, hydropower is the most important source of renewable energy, and it's expected that in the next 30 years an additional 40 capacity will be developed, and that means that about 3,700 new dams of more than 1 megawatt will be developed and become operational. The majority of those new dams will be constructed in Asia, Africa and Latin America, and only a very small amount of dams will be developed in Europe and North America, because the most suitable sites are already in use, and actually in some of those countries in this continent, dams are already being decommissioned. This development of the hydropower sector is primarily led by the private sector and financially supported by different international finance institutes, and the role of the government is still limited but is emerging. So in 2018, Moran and his colleagues carried out an extensive literature review focusing on large dams in developing countries and especially the environmental and social effects of those dams. And they concluded that the economic benefits are in general overestimated, whilst the environmental and social costs of those large dams in general are underestimated, and that it's in future more difficult to identify so-called good hydropower projects that are economically feasible and environmental and socially acceptable, because it's more difficult to find those sites. So then the question is how to identify the good projects to still develop the potential and increase the capacity of hydropower with another 40%. Therefore, we think that a paradigm shift is necessary, a shift from a focus on project development towards strategic planning. And then especially strategic planning supported by SEA. That is a process that is led by the government and should be engaged. The private sector should engage the private sector and the civil society, and we do think that the International Finance Institute can play an encouraging role in this necessary shift. What is strategic environmental assessment? Strategic environmental assessment is generally agreed to be a tool to support and improve strategic planning and decision making. SEA complements strategic planning by integrating environmental issues, evaluate or interlinkages with economic and social issues, and facilitating a public and governmental dialogue on these issues. So how is SEA different from environmental and social impact assessment? Well, first, the aim is different. It focuses more on prevention rather than mitigation. The scope differs because it primarily it also includes the assessment of institutions and the governance situation and context. SEA also includes the cumulative impacts of many projects. The process is different from ESIA because it's more a continuous process following a planning cycle. The financing is different because in SEA it's always the government who in principle pays for the SEA process. And finally, the proponent is always a government authority or a group of government authorities who are taking the lead. SEA has a legal basis in an increasing number of countries. our organization is keeping record of the adoption of legislation, and about 100 countries nowadays have legally established SEA. And we do see that it's mandatory in nearly all high-income countries. It's mandatory in Europe since 2004. Then the EU SEA directive became in place. It's growing very quickly in the rest of the world. And the UN SEA protocol that came in action in 2012 provides international good practice guidance for the implementation of SEA in practice. On this map you see how the last 50 years national SEA countries have adopted SEA legislation. And secondly, you see that in those countries where there is no legislation yet, in quite a large number, they are applying SEA on a voluntary basis. So we do expect that in 10, 20 years from now, the majority of all countries will have adopted SEA in legislation. So SEA evolved to complement ESIA. Environmental and social impact assessment typically supports decision-making at project level, while strategic environmental assessment supports decision-making on government programs, plans, and policies. So SEA complements the strategic planning process. It's actually an SEA process that supports strategic planning. So when we are talking about strategic planning, you can think about, for example, a national energy plan, a national water plan, a national hydropower plan, or a river basin plan. So the SEA process consists of 3 pillars. First, the information pillar, as we call it, that provides a solid assessment of the environmental and other issues. Secondly, a dialogue is facilitated to structure the debate between the government and the public on these issues. Thirdly, SEA Press tries to influence the strategic planning process by developing a mechanism that takes the results of the assessment and the debate into account in the strategic planning process. So the key decisions supported by SEA, if we are talking about hydropower plants, is first of all the purpose of proposed hydropower projects, whether they are single or multi-purpose projects, the capacity of the hydropower projects ranging from micro, medium to large-scale hydropower projects, the type of projects, whether it's a reservoir project, a run-of-the-river project, or a pump storage project. Especially the pump storage has become very important nowadays, and actually what it is a hydropower project consisting of 2 reservoirs, and during a period of time when electricity generated, for example, by wind farms or solar is available, then the water can be pumped to the upper reservoir, and when there is no energy available because of during the night or when there is no wind, the electricity can be generated by hydropower when it's flowing from the upper to the lower reservoir. A very other important key decision supported by SEA is site selection of the possible hydropower projects. Also, and that is a development, we do see that SEA can also support national energy plans, supporting the future fuel mix. And in some countries, hydropower can be an important component of this fuel mix. Another important decisions that are typically subject in an SEA for national energy plans are import-export division. Then we talk about connectivity with neighboring countries and the dependency on neighboring countries as well. Site selection for investments in future energy infrastructure is an important issue that can be assessed in SEA. And phasing of the investments over the years is also a very important decision that can be studied in the SEA process. Next is the SEA for Sustainable Development of the Hydropower sector. This is actually the study I was referring to. In June this year, we have released this report after a study of about 2 years. And in this study consisted of 3 components. So we started with an inventory of tools supporting the hydropower sector. And besides strategic environmental assessment and environmental and social impact assessment, we noticed that cumulative impact assessment is a tool that is often applied by the international finance institutes, especially IFC is very active in supporting this tool. But this tool is primarily applied for project development or for a series of projects in sub-catchments. The Hydropower Sustainability Assessment Protocol is a tool developed by the International Hydropower Association based in London. That is also primarily focusing on project development, although there is a so-called early phase in this protocol, but it's not yet applied a lot in practice. Then there is the Hydropower by Design tool developed by the Nature Conservancy based in the United States of America. And this is a method that is aiming to optimize hydropower projects in a river basin. And that is typically a method that can also be used in SEA. So those 3 tools are, they distinguish from SEA and ESIA because those are voluntary tools, while ESIA and also SEA increasingly is becoming a legal tool. The second step in this study is the inventory of SEA studies supporting hydropower development in the last 25 years. About 37 studies have been identified. Most of them, or considerable number of them, supporting national energy plans, including hydropower, some of them on multi-sector plans, and about 16 were focusing on the hydropower sector. So out of those 16, we made a kind of brief evaluation of the influence of those 16 cases. And we selected the most influential cases, a case on Vietnam that will be presented later on by Lothar Lunde, a case on Rwanda that will be presented by François Tettereau later on, and then 3 more cases which are in the report, a case on hydropower development in the Upper Ganges prepared by Asher Ifansi, an SEA for a National Hydropower Plan prepared the case by Kate Lazarus and Matthew Corbett, and an SEA case supporting the development of hydropower in the Indus Basin in Pakistan by David Annan. Thank you very much for your attention. Good. Now it's time for the first case study, and that is the case study that will be presented by Lothar Lunde, an SEA for National Power Development Planning in Vietnam.
Today, I would like to introduce you to the strategic environmental assessments supporting the power development planning in Vietnam. I'll start with a brief overview of the global and regional context, introduce you to the Vietnam power development planning process, explain to you the evolution of SEA in Vietnam, then go deeper into the phases of SEA support in Vietnam, in particular the PDP-6, PDP-7 and the PDP-7 revision, and then I'll summarize the key achievements and lessons learned for you in the end. The energy sector is a major driver of pollution and climate change, including greenhouse gas emissions, pollutions such as particulate matters, SOx, NOx,
and that's particularly strong with fossil fuel thermal sources such as coal and gas. Still, coal and gas is still considered cheap for the wrong reasons, because the real cost of fossil energies is much higher due to externalities not being accounted for. That is, for instance, environmental impacts and health impacts. And also, these sources of energy often are supported by perverse incentives such as subsidies and taxations, which artificially lower the prices. If those are all included or removed, they are much higher than they are currently perceived. At the same time, the cost of renewable energy has been falling in the past decades and will continue to fall. In Vietnam, the power development planning is done every 10 years, including an outlook for 10 years ahead, and usually revisions on a 5-yearly basis. In the mid-2000s, when the SEA started, these power developments had some major gaps. That was that externalities, as just mentioned, health and environmental externalities, were usually not accounted for. There was a very narrow look at the energy mix, mostly thermal with some large hydro, but no other sources. And there was no real consideration of looking into energy efficiency and demand-side management optimization. At the same time, there was increasing pressure on a national, also international level to align with national international policies and commitments, for instance, on the SDG commitments, climate change and environmental legislation. In the table, you can see how in the PDP6, the energy mix was distributed. And you can see here that almost two-thirds of the capacity in megawatt is produced by coal-fired, gas-fired, or diesel and oil-fired sources, and large hydro with 10,000 megawatt. So you see very little other sources and a very heavy domination of thermal energy. To make the power development planning more sustainable, the government of Vietnam made strategic environmental assessment a legal requirement with its 2005 law on environmental protection. To help with the implementation, it issued several regulations on strategic environmental assessment, including 2 decrees and 1 circular. However, there was still very little practical SEA experience in the ministries that were now facing the requirement on doing an SEA without having staff that was experienced in the steps and in the implementation. To comply with the SEA requirement, the Ministry of Industry and Trade, which is in charge of the PDP, requested ADB for building SEA support with its Institute of Energy, which is a subdivision of MOIT, and in charge and tasked with the SEA implementation for the PDP. This support was extended over a course of 10 years in 3 particular phases, starting with the PDP6, which at the point of the SEA support had already been completed. So this was an ex-post pilot SEA between 2007 and 2008. This was followed by an SEA support to the PDP7. That was ex ante, parallel to the writing on the plan and directly feeding into the plan. And it was continued with the revision of the PDP7 between 2013 and 2014, also ex ante, parallel to the writing of that revision. I'll now quickly walk you through the 3 SEAs mentioned and highlight the particular achievements of each of them. Starting with the PDP6, the SEA of the PDP6, this SEA was a pure pilot SEA to introduce the concepts, the steps, and the value of each of those steps to the Institute of Energy. It was an ex-post SEA, which means it had no direct impact on the PDP anymore, which was completed by this time already. It was entirely led by external experts because there was no particular SEA experience in the Institute of Energy at this point. It also focused only on the hydropower subsector. It did not look at the broader energy mix or energy efficiency questions. And within the energy hydropower subsector, It assessed the impacts by developing the so-called total preference index, which was used as a ranking for the candidate hydropower plants identified to be implemented as part of the Power Development Plan 6. The TPI measured the economic viability of the candidate power plants, including both environmental and social impacts and cost of impacts, both for the direct inundation zone as well as for a broader zone of influence that was defined by the level of access created through infrastructure for building the dam. Higher TPI stands for a better candidate plant, and the SEA has developed several alternative scenarios which were defined by different levels of reduction of high impact hydropower plants to the degree of alternative 4, where no hydropower projects would be implemented. There you also see the limitation of this SEA and looking only at the hydropower subsector, because whatever hydropower plants would not be considered, it would be replaced by thermal power, which was not assessed, but which is also unlikely being a sustainable alternative. By the time the SEA of the PDP6 was completed, the work on the Power Development Plan 7 commenced, and with it created an opportunity to do the first SEA that was done ex ante, that means parallel with the development of the PDP. At the same time, the PDP7 was very much approached as a business as usual. It predicted a very rapid rise in electricity demand, 15% per annum, and it wanted to respond to this simply with an expansion of generation capacity, in particular from coal-fired thermal power plants to expand those. The SEA of the PDP7 improved from the previous SEA in several aspects. Firstly, it looked at different types of power generation, not just on hydropower as the previous SEA. It applied a more comprehensive accounting method for the externalities, including the use of advanced GIS methods. And through those, it was able to demonstrate the economic viability of applying higher renewable energy targets and also introducing energy efficiency measures. And you see this in the tables below, what this means with regard to cost savings. Although the SEA of the PDP7 provided a comprehensive picture of the environmental and social costs involved with different power sources, and as a result of this managed to introduce a small amount of renewable energy in the energy mix, the PDP7 still heavily relied on coal and natural gas and oil as power sources. The government responded to this, asking for a revision because both the demand scenario was considered too high, as well as the environmental and social costs as being unacceptable. As a result, the PDP7 was revised, both with regard to lowering the energy demand scenario and to increase the share of renewables and energy efficiency measures. You can see the results on the right side of the table, in particular here, and on the renewable energy side, a significant change. Total, this was expected to amount to 100 million tons of CO2 saved, equivalent to $1 billion or 8% of the INDC target that Vietnam set itself. At the same time, it was also considered to not increase the predicted generation cost per kilowatt. Summing up, the key achievements of the 3 SEAs were to improve the decision-making of the PDPs by introducing transparent and evidence-based accounting methods for environmental and social impacts. They also achieved shifting the PDPs towards sustainability by including energy efficiency measures and a shift towards more renewable energy. They also gradually increased the government commitment to SEA and the government ownership of SEA, which partially compensated for limited civil society inputs. The government commitment also allowed for rapid phasing out of external support. And overall, the costs of the SEA of an SEA were insignificant in relation to the calculated anticipated gains. Finally, I want to share a few lessons learned with you during our 3 SEAs. Firstly, SEA policies and regulations are an important motivation for involved ministries to commit to and engage in SEA capacity development. They should be in place already, like in the case of Vietnam, or be developed early on during the SEA capacity building. Secondly, unbiased and evidence-based quantitative analysis is critical to the SEA recommendations being accepted and incorporated in the PDP process. And thirdly, successful institutionalization of SEA capacity should not be expected after support to a single SEA only. Several rounds of SEA capacity support might be necessary, although with decreasing inputs and related costs. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Lothar, for this presentation. Looking backward on the SEA process and your involvement, what would be your elevator pitch if somebody would ask you, Lothar, what has been the key influence of those SEA processes?
Very briefly, I think we started with a lot of skepticism on SEA, with no capacity, a lot of skepticism, and people wanted to continue business as usual. It was an added effort that no one was particularly looking at and no one was getting rewarded for in the beginning. And we managed in the course of 10 years to actually convince both, obviously, the Institute of Energy, which was tasked with the SEA, but also the PDP writers, that this was actually a contribution to a better plan. We managed to change the plan. You could see it in the numbers. You have a reduction in coal by 22,000 megawatts and a 7-fold increase in renewables, largely wind, solar, and small hydro. And with that, I would think in a course of 10 years, that is a significant improvement over the sustainability of the previous plans, the PDP6. At the same time, it has also triggered more commitment to develop more policy development. The SEA, the law on environment was already in place, but it also triggered the whole discussion on sustainable hydro, also triggered the development or contributed to development of the PFAS decree, the Payment for Forest Environmental Services decree, which has also later led to another SEA that applied that in Quang Nam on the land use plan. So there's multiple spin-offs, success SEAs influencing more policy, supporting SEA implementation. So that really started to get the process rolling, and we've seen a lot of ownership from the government side, and going as far as presenting in the IAIA, for instance. So overall, a very positive development.
Thank you very much, Lothar, for your elevator pitch. Then the floor is for François Tettereau, who is going to present his next case. But before we actually start, I would like to emphasize that the presentation made by Lothar, as well as the presentation and case study made by François, are prepared on a personal basis. That is, I think, important to emphasize. François, I think it's your turn to present your case.
First of all, I would like to convey my appreciation to the NCEA team for this opportunity to share my reflections on the benefit for applying strategic environmental assessment to an integrated water resources management planning process using a case of Upper Nyabarongo catchment in Rwanda. This catchment is one of the 9 level 1 catchments in the country. It is the most upstream catchment and high potential for hydropower development, as highlighted in red. The total surface area for the catchment is 3,348 square kilometers, which represent approximately 12.7% of the total surface area of the country. The average annual rainfall is above 1,600 millimeter. The elevation ranges from 1,400 to 2,900. So currently, as illustrated in the map, there are 5 hydropower plants with a total operational capacity of around 51.5 megawatts. So the main objective of the catchment plan was to ensure a sustainable management of water, land, and related natural resources, with the ultimate goal to contribute to sustainable socio-economic development and the improvement of livelihood of the communities within the catchment. The specific objectives were mainly to improve both water quality and quantity, to reduce the pressure on natural resources, and to ensure an equitable water resource allocation to multiple users, as well as to strengthen the water governance at catchment level. During the planning process, one of the key steps was to look at the various pressures, driving forces, and the potential management measures within the catchment. And what can highlight here is that one of the main challenges was the high sedimentation of the river, which had a high negative impact to hydropower development. This slide illustrates the key steps required for a strategic environmental assessment process, as well as the required step for an integrated water resource management planning process and the correlation between the two. This is what was done during the planning process for this particular catchment, and the efforts were made to ensure that at every stage of the planning process, all the key steps required for both strategic environmental assessment and integrated water resource management planning process are considered. And this happened to be extremely effective and productive at the end of the planning process. Considering that one of the key requirements for both a strategic environmental assessment process as well as an integrated water resource management planning process, there have been an extensive stakeholders engagement whereby a specific catchment task force was established, composed by various key players in the catchment, but also the representative of key sectors linked to water resources. So as part of the planning process, a number of scenarios were assessed, which included economic development, population growth, and climate change impacts. At the same time, a number of management alternatives were assessed, and this included to increase water storage within the catchment in order to take advantage of the high rainfall within the catchment and increase water resource availability. And the second management alternative was to increase water storage combined with sustainable land management. The third alternative was a combination of the first and the second alternative, plus promoting water use efficiency. And then the last alternative was a combination of the first three alternatives, plus reducing the irrigation potential within the catchment. So from a detailed analysis and an extensive consultation with the key stakeholders as highlighted in the previous slide, it was agreed to consider the medium scenario, which is the moderate economic development, population growth, and the climate change impact. And this scenario was applied to each of the 4 management alternatives, and at the end, it decided to consider the third alternative, which is the increase of water storage combined with sustainable land management plus water use efficiency as the best alternative. The main reason to not consider the last alternative, which was also bringing in to reduce the irrigation potential in the catchment, was that it was found that water availability was not a limiting factor within the catchment. This slide is just an illustration of a typical sustainable land management plan for one of the sub-catchment, which illustrates the various proposed management measures, as well as an illustration of one of the typical sustainable land management measures, which is terracing combined with agroforestry, which is a very effective measure to reduce soil loss, but also to increase water infiltration, and ultimately to also increase agricultural productivity. So from this process, the key results were, first of all, is that a catchment restoration opportunity mapping and decision support system was developed to guide soil erosion control interventions. The second was a developed water resource allocation model for the catchment. And the third key result was the proposal to establish a governance structure at the catchment level, which was later on provided in the water law of 2018. And this was a result of the strategic role played by the Catchment Task Force. So the key lesson learned from this combination of an integrated water resource management planning process with a strategic environmental assessment is that the 2 processes are participatory and are equally valuable in shaping the planning process. The second lesson learned is that this structured process allowed for a plan development in an extensive participatory manner. And the third lesson learned is that this integrated approach for the catchment development plan resulted in a set of measures that will stop soil erosion, which is key to sustain the existing hydropower plant within the catchment, but also to trigger future investment for hydropower development within the catchment. So in concluding, I would say the added value of ESIA to the IWM process was that this combination triggered an extensive consultation process with a wide range of stakeholders, which enhanced buy-in at the early stage. The second advantage was that this triggered the consideration of multiple alternatives. And lastly, this combination triggered a proper documentation of the planning process and lesson learned. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Francois, for giving your presentation. I also have a question for you. So what is your message to people in the same position as you were at the start of the development of the National Water Resources Plan, including ESIA? So what is your key message to people in that position? Why should they apply ESIA?
Thank you, Aaron, for the questions. In the beginning of the planning process, there was a long debate around whether we really need ESIA, especially for an IWM planning process, due to the perception of the similarities between the two. But at the end, we agreed on doing both processes. And in between, not even at the end, we all realized it was actually very effective. And this was reflected in the results we obtained later on with the adoption of number of alternatives. For our case, there were 4 alternatives, and including a proper process in selecting the best one to adopt, which was also a non-technical decisions, but going through an extensive consultation with key stakeholders, which might not have been the case if we were to use only the development process. And at the end, one of the best alternatives, which included an extremely important element of reducing soil loss, which is the main threat for hydropower development within the catchment, was considered. And now it's under implementation, as you have seen in one of the pictures in the presentation. The second thing was that at the end, the established task force, which was like the vehicle for the planning process, which included mostly non-expert persons, that's people living in the catchment but having different interests, without necessarily being experts in either area. And this vehicle was later on seen as a very strategic instrument, and at the end it was legalized as a governance structure which is needed, and this one is expected to guide future plans and obviously making use of the ESIA. So those are what I perceived as the really very interesting lesson learned from this approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Francois, for your very clear and straightforward messages. Then we continue with the last presentation, and that is a summary of the main findings based on the analysis of the 5 case studies we have prepared and included in our study. So if we look at the influence of ESIA based on those 5 case studies, we see that awareness has been raised among stakeholders on environmental and social impacts. We do see in all cases that the cooperation between especially the Ministry of Environment and Energy has improved and increased. In 2 out of those 5 cases, there is more clarity about the go and no-go areas for future hydropower development. In 2 out of the 5 cases, there was an easing tension between the stakeholders in the process. In 2 out of the 5 cases, the ESIA resulted in avoidance of investments in hydropower projects at sites with high social and environmental risks. And in 3 out of the 5 cases, some new forms of legislation was developed. Next, please. So the factors explaining this influence, the 4 key factors is, first, we do see that social unrest in the countries due to planned development of large hydropower plants in the past is a very important reason why a government and other actors are supportive towards ESIA for hydropower development. Secondly, an increasing government concern about expected cumulative environmental and social costs of existing and planned hydropower projects is an important factor. Thirdly, we do see that the engagement of key stakeholders, and then I really mean stakeholders from all different groups of stakeholders, as well as funding, are important factors. And of course, finally, well known in the ESIA community, a high level political commitment at the level at ministries or even at prime minister's level. So as a group of authors involved in this study, we also thought about what could be the potential advantages of ESIA for dam owners in general. Well, we do think that it can contribute to a better understanding of the cumulative impacts of hydropower projects. It definitely provides a better insight in the trade-offs between environment, economic and social issues, enhancing the chance of finding win-win options. It contributes to an enhanced credibility in the eyes of the affected stakeholders. For the dam owners and private sector, it minimizes the reputation risks for their business. Also because there is less conflict as a result of ESIA, It saves time and funds in the processes for licensing. And ultimately, we do expect that in future, after having done an SEA, there will be better access to funding by international finance institutes. So finally, as a group of contributors to this study, and I would definitely also mention and emphasize the important role of Roel Slootweg, who was one of the key authors of the report and started the research. So together with Roel, I have been co-editing this study. We agreed that what should be the agenda for the future. And we all agreed that there is need for SEA guidance supporting the strategic planning of the hydropower sector. And in addition, we should establish mechanisms to secure that this guidance will also be adopted by platform organizations in the sector, like the International Hydropower Association and the International Commission on Large Dams, governments, as well as the financing institutes again. So together with the International Association for Impact Assessment, we discussed this agenda for the future, and they adopted this agenda and even extended the initiative because they would like to use SEA to support the worldwide energy transition. And therefore, IAEA has taken the initiative to start the development of good practice guidance, not only focusing on SEA for hydropower development, but also supporting guidance, developing guidance for the support of national energy plans, integrated river basin plans at all levels, national as well as international level, and the development of subsector plans for the hydropower, solar, wind, and probably biomass and other sectors. So that is ongoing. Other partners in the finance sector as well as in the hydropower sector are very much willing to contribute, and we are working on finding partnerships. Thank you very much. So, Q&A, I must say that already Lothar Lunde responded to most of the questions that were raised concerning the case of Vietnam. We promised that we will respond to all questions, and the answers to the questions as well as the questions will become available on the website of the Commission. There you will also find the report that can be downloaded in free. Presently, it's available in English. We are working on a French translation, so that will become available soon. So, that is all for now. Please keep in touch. We really would like to thank you for attending this webinar. And of course, I would finally thank Francois as well as Lothar for their valuable contribution, and Anna Hardon for her support. Thank you very much, and hope to see you not only virtual, but face-to-face again as well. Thank you very much.